So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us in your afternoon for this professional development opportunity. Thank you, Rachel, for coming here. Rachel Gammons will be presenting Librarian and Manager, both and yet neither, a collective case study examining the experiences of women identifying middle manager teaching librarians at ARL Libraries. And I'm going to pass it on to you now, Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to share my screen. So get everything set up here. Okay. I am going to try to keep my eye on the chat or hands raised for questions, but Rusty, if you could help me out if folks have questions as we're going along in case I miss it.
Absolutely.
Okay, good afternoon. It is so nice to be here with you. Thank you so much for including me in this conversation. I'm so excited to see some familiar names, former students here. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Maryland, so I'm defending my dissertation in about a month and a half. So this is the first time that I'm having an opportunity to publicly talk through this research, which is really exciting for me. My pronouns are she and her. You're welcome to call me Rachel. And I am also the head of teaching and learning at the University of Maryland Libraries, which I have been at for more than a decade at this point, which is kind of wild to say. So qualitative research, I identify as a qualitative researcher, and research emerges from and is connected to my identity and my research focuses on individual, oh good, yeah, go Terps, focuses on individual social identity and social reality and how those contribute to building a collective experience. So positionality and reflexivity are really important to me as a researcher. So I wanted to start by grounding this presentation by sharing some of the salient aspects of my identity. Qualitative research is necessarily situated or placed in proximity to participants in the phenomenon. So I identify as a woman, in particular a cis woman, and my pronouns are she and her. My racial and ethnic identity, I identify as white. I am a librarian by both training and practice. In particular, I'm an academic librarian, and even more specifically, I identify as an academic teaching librarian. My identity as an educator is also really important to me, and is really central in my praxis. So my identity as a teacher and educator is something I hold really close. I also identify as a scholar practitioner, which is a multifaceted identity that emerges at the nexus of research and practice and really focuses on the integration of research with practice, the application of research to practice, and the cohabitation in dual spheres of research and practice. So that's something that's important to me, is that my work is directly tied to my research and my research to my work. On a personal level, I have a close proximity to intellectual disability, and that's something that holds salience for me. I am also a product of public education systems, which is something that comes up more than you would think in my research. So from preschool all the way up through my now doctorate work has all been connected to public universities, and that's something that I'm committed to sustaining and improving is public education. I also identify as a first-generation college student. So both of my parents now have degrees, but they returned as adults to get those. And so it really did shape my experience and entry into education. Socioeconomically, I identify as middle class, and I identify as a millennial. So I don't know how much credence you put in generational divides. I think it tends to be more individual than we suspect, but I do think there is a particular emphasis on motherhood and parental responsibility in a millennial generation, and that is something that shapes how I approach mentorship and research and education, and also my work as a librarian. So what I'm going to talk to you today is my dissertation research. So I'm just going to read this problem statement and you can bear with me. So my research is a collective case study, which seeks to understand how 9 women-identified middle manager academic research librarians navigated their platforms of power, privilege, and professional responsibility to interpret and respond to manifestations of neoliberal ideology in higher education, which in this case was learning analytics, and how their professional values and experiences were shaped through the pressures of gender identity and faculty status. And now you can just ignore all of that, and I will tell you what it means. So I am using a qualitative method. So I am using specifically qualitative collective case study, which is an inductive research method. It builds on the framework of case study research, so if you're familiar with case study, but it has 2 levels of analysis instead of 1. So it builds individual cases and examines those, and then also looks at collective cases or examines all of the cases as a body together to provide identify like shared themes and patterns. And it provides a more nuanced investigation of a research phenomenon. My theoretical framework, which kind of like guides my research and is a central point in like how I'm analyzing the data, understanding the data, my motivations for research, is neoliberalism. And that's important to understand like how that shapes my view on higher education. So put very simply, there's like millions of dissertations on neoliberalism, but Rachel Gammons, TM, put simply, it's an economic and political ideology that advocates for free market capitalism, deregulation, and limited government intervention in the economy. And put even more simply, it is a belief that like individual prosperity and success is strengthened through competition and capitalism. So that's shaping the way I'm approaching this research. My participants' case study requires very particular boundaries around your case study. It's incredibly specific. So for the context of this research, I examined women-identified middle manager librarians who were the head of a formal teaching and learning unit at an Association of Research Libraries member library. And that library had to offer faculty status or a formalized rank and promotion system to librarians. So it could have been like librarian 2 to librarian 3 or assistant professor to associate professor, but some kind of like formal rank and promotion system. And to explore that phenomenon, I used multiple data collection methods. So from all participants, I collected personal statements that they used in their promotion packets from like assistant to associate. If they didn't have that, or if it'd been forever since they applied and it no longer like adequately conveyed their approach to librarianship, I accepted a surrogate document. So that could have been like a cover letter, I got a diversity statement, but some kind of document that like encapsulated their approach to values and the impactful threads of their research, scholarship, and librarianship. I also conducted 90-minute interviews, semi-structured interviews, one-on-one with each of the participants and transcribed those. I collected position descriptions for all of the participants, and then all of those created case studies or case reports, which eventually themselves became a document that I analyzed. So today I'm going to talk to you about a few different threads of my research. So this study examines professional values and ethics, mid-level managers, and then also learning analytics. But today I'm really going to focus specifically on the implications of this research for practitioners and mid-level management in academic libraries. So I'm kind of going to de-emphasize the values and ethics piece and the learning analytics piece, not because it's not important, but because I really want this talk to be focused on bringing to light an experience that's kind of underexplored and underacknowledged in the literature, and hopefully offers some like important ways for you to understand your own experience and support your colleagues. But briefly, summarizing like a 60-page literature review into one slide, modern librarianship prioritizes 3 values: intellectual freedom, information access, and user privacy is kind of our core values that cross all of librarianship. But neoliberalism's influence on academic library has complicated or problematized our relationship to those values, and that has created tensions in library policies and practices. This is seen in the pressures that libraries and librarians feel to justify their existence and innovate new services, the devaluation of interpersonal and relational work like teaching and reference, and the adoption of corporate management strategies and structures, which has included an increase in administrative positions and a growing class of middle managers. Within that, women and librarian of color tend to be overrepresented among lower librarian faculty ranks, lower management and leader positions, and management positions in which failure is more likely to be visible and public. So this is particularly like intersecting with a marginalized community and ways of understanding gender identity and racial identity and social justice. And then just to like ground our conversation in a shared understanding, learning analytics is the collection and analysis of data related to learners with the aim of optimizing academic performance and success by improving institutional efficiency and profitability in education. And specifically in the context of this study, neoliberalism, learning analytics served as a manifestation of neoliberalism. So it could have been anything. There are any number of manifestations of neoliberalism, but I used learning analytics as the particular lens to evaluate this. So the research gaps, there are numerous research gaps this study and hopefully future research addresses. So first, research on academic librarianship focuses a ton of research on faculty status and librarian identity in psychology. It's like a wealth of really high quality done studies. But there's a lack of exploration into how faculty experience shapes library leaders. If you know of any studies, I would be so open to like hearing about them. But it's interesting because it really does shape like the organization, the proximity to faculty status. And this is not has not been a thread that has really been explored, how this impacts library leaders. There's also a bunch of research on library deans and directors, some research on associate deans, and there's kind of a lack of research on lower management positions. Particularly, there's a lack of research that uses methods that go beyond a survey methodology. Not that a survey methodology can't be like effective and impactful, but really like exploring the nuanced experiences of those librarians, that's lacking in the LAS literature. There's also research on the instruction coordinator, which like may or may not be a position that holds positional authority or supervision. But there's a gap in examining the experiences of department head librarians who are overseeing teaching and learning units, which is interesting because these positions play a really pivotal role in like coordinating teaching activities and managing undergraduate programs for these large libraries. And then finally, the existing literature on learning analytics really positions learning analytics as a, quote, divisive third rail in the profession. And it depicts librarians as lacking the, quote, lacking the expertise to navigate ethically sticky methodological situations. So it really approaches librarianship from a deficit perspective, assuming that librarians aren't equipped to navigate these conversations, and also assuming that the primary benefit librarians stand to offer learning analytics, that conversation, is in increasing kind of like stringency around user privacy policies. So like bringing our values to the learning analytics process. And there's really no exploration of what we might be able to contribute beyond that. So that's kind of like the 4 areas that I'm looking at. So I'm going to zip through this kind of quickly. These slides are here if you'd like to reference it in the past, but this was, my research took place over the last like year and a half or so. I defended right before my baby was born, and he's now like almost 18 months. So I have a really clear benchmark of when it started. So it began with recruitment. I sent recruitment emails to, I think it was 50 something ARL people at ARL libraries. I ended up with a pool of about 20. And then I selected 9 librarians who were representative of that sample and also represented like the most diverse social identities and experiences and pathways that I could have. I analyzed the data, and then I emerged from that 9 individual collective case studies. The case studies range from about 4 to 6 pages. And then after all the case studies were complete, I analyzed those and then drew cross-case themes. And the cross-case themes led to assertions, which is really what we're going to dig into today. So the assertions are the most salient conclusions that can be drawn from across the themes that were like highly indicated in all of the cases. And then it ends in this presentation, which I'm giving right now, and hopefully a defense very soon. So the individual case studies, I mentioned there were 2 levels in case study research. So each of the case studies, if you're familiar with case studies, you know they tend to have like a structured format or a way of presenting the data. So each case study followed the same pattern. So it began with a background, presenting anonymized demographic data that established, oh, I should also mention back here, these are not their real names. These are all pseudonyms that I use. Like everyone's identity is protected in this research. And thank you to my participants for your time and experiences. Okay, so the case studies, it goes over anonymized information about their background. It moves into their professional identity. So examines their motivations for coming into the profession, their values and experiences and developmental milestones. I then examine gender identity and leadership. So looking at their particular like proximity to their own gender identity, how that has shaped their work, their management style, their values as leaders, and the integration of their social identities in various aspects of their work. I then explore faculty status, so looking specifically at like their relationship to faculty rank and promotion, how that shaped their own journey and experience. And then I end with learning analytics, or examining the attitudes, values, and decision-making processes and institutional pressures that have emerged from and through learning analytics. Okay, so these 9 individual cases, from those, I drew about 13 themes. So these themes mirror the individual cases, and they focus on 4 focus areas. And the themes were highly or middling indicated in at least like 65%, so at least 6 cases, often more. And indication is a combined factor of frequency and intensity. So these were things that were like highly apparent in at least 6 of the 9 cases. So the 4 focus areas, again, mirror those individual cases. The first is exploring professional identity and academic librarianship. The second was gender identity, leadership, social justice, and academic librarianship. The third was faculty status, and then the fourth was the impact of learning analytics on academic libraries. And I'm going to walk you through all 4 of these. So the first area of focus was exploring professional identity development or professional identity and academic librarianship through the lens of these 9 women. And 4 themes emerged from this particular focus area. So the first was embracing library value. So participants, they integrated professional and personal values into their work as librarians, and they used incredibly value-laden language to discuss even like routinized tasks. So purchasing an air filter or setting up meetings. They talked about like how this work emerged from their commitment to librarianship, their commitment to like serving their colleagues and being a good collaborator and a good contributor to the work and being a good manager. Like it really emerged from the sense of like a duty to support and serve. They also, across all the cases, they exhibited a really high commitment and dedication to teaching and students. So they viewed teaching, and particularly undergrad students, as really central to their professional identity. That was often like their commitment to students was what drew them to the profession, and they found fulfillment in finding like creative avenues to scale up their instruction to meet the needs of users. They found a lot of meaning in working one-on-one with students and providing reference, and that like was a central component of their identities. They also like almost nearly all, I won't say all, but 7 of the cases, there's a real strong reticence to advance among these women. So they acknowledged, and they said repeatedly, like using different words, that every progression up in management moved them further from the work, which was like a phrase that was repeated. So they were reticent to advance into higher levels like associate dean or director because they perceived that movement as a loss in their connection to teaching and students. And they highlighted the tension between like career progression and professional fulfillment. So they saw a lot of like meaning and opportunity that came from leadership and advancement, but at the same time, they viewed that as a loss and really cutting back on like the joy and the fulfillment that they found in their work, which was related to their work as a practitioner. And the last was navigating dual roles. And this identity schism came out in a lot of different ways, but they experienced ambiguity and tension as they balanced their administrative responsibilities with their day-to-day work as librarians. So many of them had subject area responsibilities. They were teaching, they were managing, they were faculty members, they were moving in between all of these identities and spaces. And the responsibilities and expectations of one kind of directly inhibited their ability to succeed and perform well in the other. But losing any one of them was difficult for them to comprehend. So like they preferred to keep even limited access to all of these areas rather than lose one entirely. The second focus area is gender identity, leadership, social justice, and academic librarianship. So again, these were all women identified mid-level managers of teaching units. So this certainly comes into play. But the 4 themes that emerged from this kind of like cohesive analysis was first fostering community and care. So there was a real emphasis on like team identity, unit work. They emphasized the importance of community building and relationships and care. Care was really important to their work as middle managers. And they really strove to create supportive environments while also trying to hold boundaries to like protect their time. So they talked about the difficulty of like serving as a buffer in between administration and the people in their unit, but then also wanting to hold boundaries so that they didn't default into like de facto therapists for the people they were supervising or student workers in their space. And the difficulty of like navigating that liminal space in between those 2 competing priorities. There was also a broad recognition of the devaluation of feminized labor, and this came out in 2 ways. So first, they've grappled with the organizational devaluation of care-oriented labor as managers. So they talked about how they spent a lot of time like coaching, supporting, and mentoring. But when it came to annual reviews, there was really no way to like capture or communicate the value of this work, and how the time and energy they spent in these practices was not recognized or valued by the organization, which they saw evidence of because they would talk about how they saw sort of parallel people in their positions who might be male identifying, who were invested less energy, less time, less resources into that type of work, but were rewarded with commensurate rank, commensurate pay, and then, equal recognition, even though there's a differential amount of labor that was put into those activities. And then the second area was the devaluation of teaching. So they talked about that within the libraries itself, kind of this divide between like their units, which tended to have early career librarians, and like subject librarians, or other areas of libraries, which tended to have tenured librarians. Or at least like higher ranked librarians, and the sort of the devaluation of the work of their unit and how they worked hard to legitimize that the seriousness and the importance of the teaching that they did. And they made a connection between the devaluation of that work and the historical relegation of feminized labor in the library and also in higher education. The third was negotiating power and responsibility. So their experiences were shaped by their proximity to organizational power, and they saw themselves as both agents and targets of organizational power, and they shared a commitment to supporting their units, but their ability to perform that work was often inhibited by like their lack of power to affect change at an organizational level. The final theme in this area was intersectional racial identity and social justice. So their identities were shaped by their social identities, like how they moved through the organization, how they interacted with others, how they understand their own values, their own experiences. All of that was shaped by their own identities, and also their kind of like shared professional commitment to advancing social justice and the emphasis on that in the profession. The third area was faculty status. So two themes emerged here. The first is scholar practitioner identity. So almost every participant talked about the challenges of balancing and maintaining their scholarship while also fulfilling the responsibilities of management, and how that was difficult because they valued research and writing, but they found it really difficult to create time to do those things. And then the other was the challenges of navigating faculty status. So although they valued it, they also identified and recognized the challenges that came with faculty status. They expressed a perception that they, as faculty members in the libraries, received less benefits than their academic peers. And 6 out of 9 of the participants were promoted into their management positions before receiving tenure or promotion for whatever from assistant to associate or equivalent. And so they were in this almost like 65% of them were in this really challenging position of trying to articulate the impact of their management and this promotional dossier and process, which really is an atypical experience in the academy, which is where tenure is typically a prerequisite for assuming a management position, like a department chair or something along those lines. So they were supervising people at and above their rank, especially above their rank, who might have had the opportunity to vote on them in an eligible faculty meeting. They were providing mentorship to librarians at or below their rank on a process they themselves had not successfully navigated. And they were dealing with how to contextualize and explain their work as a manager in a faculty process that really didn't account for that at all. So it was a really unique and difficult experience they shared. The final was learning analytics. So this came out in 3 themes: navigating neoliberal pressures. And they talked about this, like these themes came up again. So performance-based budget models and how that disadvantaged the library, the importance of institutional rankings and moving up in institutional rankings, and the expectation and the pressure they felt to demonstrate impact and really contextualize why their work was useful and valuable to the library and the organization. And they felt a real sense of responsibility towards their units to safeguard their financial stability, their well-being, their happiness, and make sure that they were taken care of in the organization. It also emerged in ethical dilemmas and privacy concerns. So they expressed really nuanced views on learning analytics. They weighed the concerns legitimate concerns they had about privacy and ethics with the potential benefits for students and also the impact on the library. And they really emphasized the importance of informed consent, ethical decision making, and the disproportionate impact of learning analytics on marginalized students. And then the third and final theme was navigating ethical complexity. So they felt really caught between administrators library and also campus administrators who were very open to learning analytics, and their colleagues who were opposed like on principle, even though those colleagues may have not been interacting directly with learning analytics. That would mostly come out of their unit as a teaching and learning unit. They felt like the pressure of satisfying these two different groups of thanks so much, William. These two different groups of stakeholders in their organizations. So all of these themes together emerged in these 5 assertions, and this is really what I want to focus on. So the 5 experiences that kind of cut across all of the participants that were different stages of their career, different organizations, different approaches to leadership. These were the 5 things they shared. So middle-ness, both and yet neither, the cost of resistance, the feeling of being set up to fail, and the sacrifice of self in order to like enable the success and well-being of their units. So let's talk about that. So the first was middle-ness. So participants described their experience as characterized by middle-ness, which was a direct quote, which was a space of liminality in the in-between spaces of organizational power, personal responsibility, and professional accountability. Participants were quite literally positioned in the middle of the organization, and they understood themselves to be both agents and also targets of organizational power. Many of the participants, not all, but many were in the middle of their careers, and they viewed their positions as a respite before advancement to upper levels of leadership. They saw that advancement often as inevitable, but they were kind of like biding time, holding on to the joy in their jobs before they eventually let that go to become a bureaucrat, which is a direct quote. They often found themselves in the middle of conflicts, expectations, and decisions, and they described themselves as being squeezed from both sides, pulled at both ends, and having just enough power to let people down on both sides. And I pulled out a few quotes from interviews and personal statements that I thought really encapsulated these 5 assertions. And so the first was, I feel my middleness deeply. I feel like that is the only way I could describe it, is to be in the middle. Another said, being in the space by which she meant middle management. I feel like I have just enough power to let people down on both sides, on all sides. I'm just influential enough that I could make really great change and have an impact for my team, but I also have just enough power to let them down, which is hard, which is like an experience I deeply resonated with as a fellow middle manager. Another said, I'm experiencing both sides, where I'm trying to instigate positive change, by which she meant positive change in the organization, but I'm also constantly reacting to change from above and also trying to protect my team. And this came up again and again, like the importance of serving as a bubble or a buffer in between like the, objectives of the organization and also like the well-being and the stability of their team. And then also like the constant code switching that they did. So they talked about how they would move from leading a meeting as a unit leader into another meeting where they were a rank and file librarian. They would move from a meeting that was online and go directly into a one-on-one that was in person. They would do their work as a faculty member and then switch gears into putting out fires and doing mentorship. So they were constantly like moving in between these spaces that required them to like reorient themselves and their direction to librarianship and their focus as library leaders. And like that happened all day long. And in particular, coming out of COVID, like that constant moving in between electronic and physical spaces and how that schism really like impacted their ability to do their work. The second assertion or common experience was this distinct experience of feeling both and yet neither, or having this identity schism. So this participant straddled the space between 2 competing identities where they were offered access to both, but they were denied entry or like the opportunity to inhabit fully in either one of those spaces. So as middle managers, their position served as a bridge between practice and administration. So one practice on one side, administration on the other. On the one side, the practice side were the things that drew them to librarianship. So often like their commitment to supporting students. And on the other side was the ability to affect change that they saw that came with formal leadership positions. And they described how their work was personally fulfilling, but professionally unsatisfying. They spent their days putting out fires, like moving emails, moving in between meetings. Like all of their time was kind of taken up with this day-to-day administration. And the expectations of any one of these facets of their work really inhibited their ability to fully inhabit in any of the others. Their responsibilities as librarians hindered their ability to be managers. They felt like they were constantly letting someone down, even if it was just themselves. And the obligation of management reduced the time they were able to spend as librarians, but retaining access to both facets of that identity was preferable, at least at this point, to losing either. And the defining quotes here was one person who said, I want to be at the table to make decisions, which she saw as emerging like from the opportunity to advance into like an associate dean position. But I don't see how it could work in my current organization. It's like I have these two paths before me, and either way, I lose something. So either she stays at her current level and she maintains her commitment to practice, but she lacks the opportunity to like impact the direction of librarianship and affect the organization, or she moves fully into management and she loses that connection to practice. Another said, I like working with students. I like teaching. That's really why I wanted to be a librarian. When you get to a higher level, it gets into donor relations and development. So I want to make a difference, and I think I could be a good leader, but I'm not ready to let go of the work, at least not yet. The third was the feeling of being set up to fail. So they described how they were expected to perform their jobs without having access to all the tools they needed to do their work. They described how their personal and professional values often felt incompatible with neoliberal organizations. So they talked about like their ethos as a feminist manager or leader, and how their work required like a deeply unfeminist focus on productivity and impact, and really de-emphasized relational labor. They were in this difficult situation where they either like upheld the moral standards of the profession. So they really honored those values to like information freedom, information access, and privacy. But in doing so, they would fail to meet the neoliberal standards of success in their organizations, or they would compromise their values but be rewarded by the system. They struggled to do and be everything that everyone needed. And although they were rarely offered full transparency from administration about the decision-making process in their libraries, they felt responsible for being the face of administration to their teams. So some of the defining quotes were, I think that's really what it means to be in middle management, to kind of always be disappointing someone, even if it's just yourself. Another person said, I don't necessarily feel like I'm being lied to or misled from above, but I don't know everything and I'm not told everything. But then I'm the face of that for the team. Like I'm the one who has the bad answers, which I really connect. Oh yeah, same. Me too, Erin. Another person said, I feel like I'm constantly guessing. And this was about everything. Like, what do they want? What did he mean? What does she need? I'm standing in this space of anxiously awaiting, waiting to be told what to do, waiting to find out when I'm going to hurt someone I care about because I just can't give them what I need. The fourth was sacrifice of self. So to be the leaders they wanted to be, participants routinely sacrificed parts of themselves. They gave up flexibility with their schedules. They reduced the amount of time they spent on research and scholarship. They turned down professional opportunities, and they moved their personal goals and ambitions to the back burner to create space for the important work of managing. And they really specified like that relational care work was important, and that was really what was meaningful. If a professional activity reduced the energy they were able to spend in supporting others, they often dismissed that experience as selfish or self-promoting. To meet the high expectations they felt for themselves as managers, they sacrificed personal ambition and professional. They cut back on the work that was personally rewarding. They delayed their promotions, and they tried to squeeze the work they did just for themselves, such as research or scholarship, into those evenings and weekends in order to protect the time for their teams. So the defining quotes here were, on my whiteboard, I have the names of each person in my department. They are the priority. If something is going on that feels more important, by which she meant like something in her own life that felt more important, like her own research, I look over and I remember that they are the job. Another person said, I'm writing on weekends, during the week in the evenings, after my kid goes to bed. There is just no time. I also don't have time to read, either professionally or just for myself, which would inform things I would write about. So I'm forcing it. And quite a lot of people talked about this not having time to think and not having time to read. So it wasn't even that they didn't have time to write, it was that they didn't have time to do the work of thinking that would lead to scholarship and research and ideas. Like they didn't have time to invest in deep and creative thought. And another person said it can really feel challenging sometimes to do research and service in a way that doesn't feel selfish, because again, it wasn't like contributing to the success of their team, which they found really important. And the final was the cost of resistance. So as managers, participants understood that resistance comes at a cost. They identified that in a neoliberal organization, every action had a price, which could be the detriment of an interpersonal relationship, a decrease in political influence or organizational power, elimination or reduction of funding for staff members, or being denied or passed over for professional opportunities. And as middle managers, they saw their job as deciding if that price was one worth paying. So although they held their professional values in really high esteem, which was evidenced like in the way they talked about their work, their ability to honor those values was really mitigated by the responsibility they felt to protect their units and their teams, which sometimes required actions that felt really antithetical to their ethics. So the two defining quotes here, one, this was in a conversation about learning analytics, and the person said, despite like her own reticence to learning analytics, she said, I am responsible for people's livelihoods. I don't have the luxury of throwing up a privacy flag and ending the conversation. Another person said, I'm now in a position to be able to see what it all cost, both financially, but also what are we going to have to lose in order to do this other thing? What if I'm in a situation where we have to do budget cuts? I have 6 people who rely on me to make sure they have a job or get raises or get programs and are appreciated. The money is not infinite, and I have a responsibility to the team. So all of these like 5 assertions and experience, I've pulled out like 5 implications for practice that I think might be helpful for this conversation. And then I have some discussion questions for you. And I'm catching up on the chat here. But the sort of 5 implications for practice that I see. The first was improving appointment, promotion, and tenure process. So 6 out of 10, this was not something I expected to find, but 6 out of 10 participants were promoted into their management positions before tenure and promotion, which was an experience I shared as well. And this is something that really doesn't happen outside of libraries. It's very rare that you would have an academic faculty member who is promoted into like a mid-level management position, providing direct supervision to other faculty members before having the protections of tenure and promotion. And that experience is like really not accounted for in our guidelines or promotional processes. There's really a lack of support and mentorship for people who are experiencing that. And they talked about how they didn't have examples of like how to talk about management. They also talked about how their APT committees at their libraries didn't have managers. So they didn't even have anyone to go to with questions because managers didn't have time to be on these committees. So it was really difficult situation. Also, like the second implication was workload. So participants were really reticent to advance because they would lose that connection to practice. And they really saw that loss as forever. And this, again, is something that's kind of particular to libraries. So in an academic faculty position, it is maybe not common, but it's not uncommon that you would take your turn in a management position. It might be like a rotating model or a service model. And then eventually you would step back into the faculty ranks and you would resume your work. That really doesn't happen in libraries. We're kind of like an up, you advance into management and you do not leave management. And that really was holding back these women from deciding to advance because they didn't want to let go of the stuff that was important to them. And they really saw that as something that was going to affect them forever. So maybe we have something to learn from like some different rotating leadership models. The second was alignment. So participants were really limited by their organization, which tended to mirror an academic college, even though because of the influence of neoliberalism, our organizational hierarchies and structures are actually more like resemblant of a student affairs model, but all of our policies and the way that we're organizing ourselves and our labor and the way that we're talking about and demonstrating the impact of our work tends to mimic an academic college. But they had a really hard time navigating like how to succeed in that model because their work just didn't fit. The fourth was values. So they were really reliant on ethics to guide their decisions, but they felt that the professional values just were not meeting the scope and scale of modern day challenges. It didn't have the nuance. It had a really black and white approach to like what it meant to promote privacy, what it meant to promote information freedom. And they were looking for nuance. They were looking for space to like understand more directly how to navigate these challenges they were facing where they were pulled in these multiple directions. And then the last is community. So they benefited from community, so especially community with other managers. They talked about the importance of having people who shared their challenges, who understood the organization, who had to make these difficult decisions. And they really had to go out of their way to develop those networks because it wasn't something that necessarily like lended itself naturally in their organizations. They had to create those routes for themselves. Okay, so I I have these 3 discussion questions that I think I'm actually going to, I'll drop them in the chat. I'll stop sharing and drop them in the chat so I can see all your lovely faces. I also have a link to like tons of references that I've cited in this research. And I'm really excited. This is the first time I've gotten to talk about this research in a public place. So I'm so excited to hear your feedback and your impressions and if this experience resonates with you. Thank you so much for your time and like attention and being here. And I will now stop and put these questions in the chat.
That's awesome, Rachel. Thank you for sharing your research.
Thank you.
I'll facilitate if you don't mind.
Please.
So I'll just read questions. Thank you, Ray, for joining us. And Ray Pun says, thank you, Rachel. This is amazing research. We appreciate you sharing. Does anyone have, you can take your camera off. You can put something in the chat. Questions? Rachel asks everyone, how do your own experiences and perspectives as managers align with or diverge from those described by the participants in the study? Well, that's the other question then. This research emphasizes the importance of fostering inclusive and supportive communities within academic libraries. What strategies or initiatives have you implemented or encountered in your own organizations to promote the success and well-being of managers, in particular, middle managers? And if these questions don't, spark your interest in talking, you can ask Rachel any other questions that you might have from the presentation. It was really fascinating. Tracy Combine wrote, this is fascinating research indeed. This resonates strongly, although I am not faculty or teaching librarian. I manage our circulation department and maintain service points. So much of this hits hard. And Olivia Chin says, for Rachel, where do you want to go next with your research? What are some new questions that you developed during your research?
Oh, thank you so much for that generous question. I am really interested. So this experience of middleman, this is a case study, and it really focused on teaching and learning librarians and leaders of those units. But I think that this experience of mid-level managers is really specific to academic libraries, and I suspect that it extends beyond this particular group of women, and many of these themes would resonate with people in all areas of academic librarianship. So I would love to extend that and to understand how these mid-level management experiences are being shaped and inhibited. And also, like, we have a higher degree of parity in terms of like gender representation at higher levels of management that kind of drops off at the associate dean level, where we see an overrepresentation of men, and then it picks back up at a mid-level or lower level management. And I'm interested in understanding what is the ceiling? Why is that diversity and that representation not extending up into higher levels of management? And I suspect it has to do with this like reticence to not let go of your practice, to not lose your connection to librarianship and the work that you got into librarianship to do. And I think that was just really felt deeply by participants. So I'm interested to explore that more. I also have like a lot of work I want to do around learning analytics. We didn't really dig into that, but it was a really interesting conversation I had with these women, and they had so much to offer and perspectives that really hadn't been captured, I think, well. So I would love to dig more into that in the future. Thank you for that kind and gracious question.
Donna asks, do you have any suggestions for improving the situation or suggestions for us to make it through this situation?
Yeah, I do. So I am chairing our APT committee at my institution. And I think having a management, like serving as a manager and being in that role, that has been really important. So making sure that your APT committees have someone who is a manager in that position, particularly if your library is going to promote people into management positions before obtaining tenure and promotion. It's difficult if you go, these women talked about going to an APT committee and then just not being able to get answers because the APT committee didn't know how you describe how you spent hours and hours dealing with a performance issue in your promotional dossier. And it certainly wasn't something that was represented at campus level. So just representation on your APT committees, boundaries and mentorship. So both for people that are going up for promotion to protect their time, but also these women felt like they were responsible for mentoring people at and below their rank through a promotion process they hadn't gone through themselves. So making sure that you have supportive mentorship and models available so that your librarians have the support they need. So they're not solely reliant on a supervisor to provide this kind of like emotional and intellectual labor and mentorship labor when they may not have the expertise or experience to do that. I also think that like I mentioned, that rotating model of service, I think is something we may be able to draw from in libraries. So this feeling of like, once you move up into management, I can never go back. This is it. They really felt like once they advanced, this was like the end of this was the end of their connection to teaching, the end of their connection to students, and everything else was just bureaucracy and donors. So, moving towards a more acceptable model in which like you are able to advance, you have a rotating leadership model, you're able to advance and then also move back into the ranks, I think is a culture shift that we could really benefit from.
Interesting. Olivia Chin wrote, I have been in two different middle management positions, and both of them started before I was promoted to a higher academic rank. One of them was while I was a staff person, the other was a faculty position. Sarah Dornbeck is responding to, how do your own experience and perspectives as managers align with or diverge from those described by the participants of the study? And she says, I am not a supervisory position in a supervisory position and would like to embrace a scholar practitioner identity, but already experience the difficulties of trying to find the time for reading, writing, and research. Would you like to address that? Like how, I know in different places, people give time in their job descriptions to give time. How could you advocate for that in your library to have time for PD to read, write, and research? Rachel.
I am so sorry. I was catching up on the chat and I totally missed what that question was.
I was wondering based up from Sarah Dornbeck's chat, how can you work with your manager or supervisor to develop into your job description that a percentage of your time to work on professional development? Do you have any strategies for that?
Yeah, I mean, I struggle with this myself. I am also a person that writes on weekends and evenings. Um, I think some of the, at least coming from the perspective of the participants, some of the most successful strategies they used were to collaborate with people they supervised. So to use that as an opportunity for mentorship, to support junior colleagues. So they would, in terms of like accountability, they would say, let me publish with you to do XYZ. Let me submit this conference presentation for you, and then you can be the lead author, especially if they had already advanced or gotten their promotion, really using that as a way to say this is connected to my identity as a manager, it's connected to my success as a leader, and I'm also supporting junior librarians. And in addition to that, I'm exploring something that I'm interested in and passionate about. I think also just recognizing that it's not just like, if you look at the hours of your time, I think it's easy to see, oh, you have blocks. I have blocks when I could do XYZ, but you have to devote time to thinking and to reading. And that was really something that participants missed, was like they didn't carve out and they didn't protect and they didn't take that time seriously just to like be conversant in the literature, to know what people are researching, to attend professional development. So I would say that even if it was just advice I'm trying to take myself, even if it doesn't produce something, even if it doesn't end in a publication. I think treating the process of reading, treating the process of thinking as seriously and deserving of time, and putting that in your calendar and really being open and honest and upfront about how you're using that time, I think can go a long way to helping you feel like you are satisfying this part of your identity that you've had to cut back on as a manager. I also see Danielle's question. No, the case studies that I explored were all at Research Association of Research Libraries, member libraries, ARL libraries. And that was specifically because those libraries are like in particular susceptible to neoliberal pressures, not that all academic libraries are not. And they also have really high levels of like undergraduate students. And so they are investing heavily in learning analytics, which was like something I was exploring through my research. But yes, I would love to look at, I think, community college librarians. I also had 4 participants who were at minority serving institutions and 5 that were PWIs, which I really didn't get to unpack what the distinct differences in that might be. Also like private versus public. I think there's so many interesting, I hope you all do this research. I think there's so many interesting ways you could take it.
I think Tracy Crumbine asked another question. Did anyone discuss any training or lack of training in management as impacting them? This is not exactly a topic that you learn in library school.
Yes. So almost all of the participants talked about how their own experiences, positive or negative, with like being managed really shaped their own approach to management. So they tried to either emulate, like one person talked about a particular mentor and like library supervisor who used a social democratic way of leadership, and she really tried to emulate that. Another person talked about how she had a supervisor who was never available, but always left cookies on her desk, and like how she had taken from that the importance of like being clear as being kind, and being present is more important than like baking cookies and like giving like, so really, so not exactly like the lack of training, but they talked about this kind of like virtuous cycle where they emulated or attempted to like disrupt management practices that they had either experienced or seen in practice. And then they also talked about like how that relationship to power was really difficult. So like they really valued like a democratic way of making decisions, of collaboration, of collegiality, and how this feeling of like being a boss or like being in a supervisory or like positional authority over someone else was deeply uncomfortable to them, and how they sought like mentorship and guidance and also professional development around how to navigate that space. And then a few of them also talked about how the management training on campuses for faculty really wasn't for them. So like they went through these training programs and it was not at all like the kind of management that they do. And at the same time, like the staff development management programs that they went to also was not what they did. So they really had like a lack of evidence-based, like informed approaches to how to do this work and do it well.
There's another question that says, as an LIS professor teaching library management, I find this fascinating and I'm excited to learn more about where your research goes. Do you have any suggestions for areas of emphasis or focus that you believe would be beneficial for preparing new library professionals before they get into these situations?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that one thing that I'm like, I also teach LAS courses, and one thing that I'm going to take into my own practice is to talk about middle management. So I think that's a management position that students are much more likely to encounter than, and you know, for myself, like I teach an academic library course and I invite a dean to come in and speak about like how she's approaching library leadership. But I think that these kind of on the ground management experiences are much more salient and much more likely to be encountered by students. So I'm going to try to start talking about what these challenges are, how you navigate that. Also, the importance of looking out for mentorship and not just up. So at some point, you eventually lose people that have been in an organization longer than you, or like, you know, there's only so many people above you, and you really have to build your networks in the community to build these relationships with people to support you through these experiences. So I'm going to be emphasizing community building, reaching out to people that have similar positions to you. And something that I think is always good advice is like people will generally say yes. Like if you email someone and say like, I'm in a job that's similar to yours, would you like to be on a Discord with me? Like, would you like to get virtual coffee once a month? Generally, people will say yes. And I think just having the courage to initiate those conversations, to know that that work is important, will go a long way to like preparing students to be successful in those spaces. Thank you for that lovely question.
I think that ends our time today. Thank you everyone for taking your time out of your day, whether it's your lunchtime or middle of the afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the ACRL Leadership Discussion Group, and you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much for being here. It was such a pleasure.